Rock and roll. All right. Good morning, everyone. The end of the first full week of what was a historic week. I was really proud to be a Marylander this week. It was just a truly moving, incredible moment in time to move the state forward and hit the refresh button on what is the new Maryland state government. We've been in a bit of a hurry up and wait period where it felt like the plane had landed, but we were still waiting to get to the gate. And now here we are, and it's time to get to work. So I'm really thrilled today to be joined by our chair of our Budget and Taxation Committee, Guy Gazzoni, and our chair of our Judicial Proceedings Committee, Will Smith, who will follow me to give some updates about what's been happening in their committee and some of the top issues they'll be tackling this year. Just wanted to hit a couple of the highlights. We're excited to see Governor Moore put forward his new cabinet appointees. We look forward to moving through the executive nominations process in the next few weeks. We want to move quickly to make sure that the secretaries get a full vetting, but also have the full empowerment to do the work on behalf of the 6.5 million Marylanders who have entrusted them to fulfill the work of state agencies. This morning, of course, we had our first budget breakfast. I'll let Chairman Gazzoni get a little bit more into some of the pieces, and we'll let the governor certainly, I know later today, has a news release. We'll make sure that is the appropriate time for them to be able to release their highlights. I will say overall, very, very productive, thoughtful, good conversation. It was a very collaborative environment, and look forward to diving into the details of the budget proposal that the governor will put forward later today. We'll say that we're very excited about the funds that were released yesterday through executive order. Again, we'll let the chairman kind of dive into the details there. But what we know is that the people of Maryland supported the Maryland Senate Democrats' legislative agenda. That's why we expanded our majority this past year. And so it's exciting to see Governor Moore come in and recognize that and move forward a lot of the legislative priorities that we've been working on for the last decade. One more kind of logistical note, today is the bill request deadline. So for those of you who tuning in and enjoying the legislative session for the first time or in new times, this is the last day that legislators can request a bill for a timely introduction before it has to go to the Rules Committee. So we're going to see a lot more drafting. Our Department of Legislative Services does remarkable work. They are in full chaos mode at this moment now that all of the requests are in to make sure that all of the great ideas that legislators have can be put into legislative draft format and be introduced in time to be considered this year. So we will see a lot more committee work next week. We'll probably start to see some first bills hit the Senate floor by the middle of next week, maybe middle to the end of next week. But it'll be the following week we'll really start to see the heavy issues get to the Senate. It's all the work is going to be really heavy in committees where there's going to be a lot of discussion and debate and amendments and working through legislation appropriately. So without further ado, let me get to the folks who will be front and center of that. First, we'll go to Senator Will Smith, who again is our chair of our Judicial Proceedings Committee. Senator Smith.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. I'll be brief. The Judicial Proceedings Committee has yet to hold a bill hearing. We've had several briefings on some of the top-line priorities for us this session. And I hate to say it, but as of now, we have more bills assigned to JPR than any other committee in the Senate, so we are going to be very busy. But our top-line priorities are obviously the public safety, specifically gun violence. We had a briefing on the recent Supreme Court decision in Bruin. We also had a briefing on gun violence in Baltimore City and throughout the state and how to some of the strategies that we're looking to develop to combat that. And then obviously parole and probation. We had a briefing on that as well, and that'll be a top-line priority for us moving forward. And also we addressed just yesterday the statute of limitations, statute of repose, seeking civil justice for victims of child sex abuse. So with that, those are our top-line priorities. That's the action that we've been engaged in the first couple of weeks. Looking forward to hosting our first formal bill hearings in the week after next. So with that, I'll pass it off to Chairman Gazzoni.
Thank you. Let me first say that I'm pleased that you have the most bills and that we don't. Let me start with the release of the $69 million. This is, I think, instructive about question one, and I think that's why I'd like to talk about it just a minute. Of course, what had happened in the previous year was we fenced that money off. We thought there were very important matters that needed to be considered and introduced in the budget. Governor disagreed with us. We fenced the money. And of course, he had the right to use that money or not, and he chose not to. The next governor comes in and he said, okay, these are our priorities, and these are the things that we need to do. and so that was released. Now, you put that in the context of where we would have been had we had question one last year, and what we would have had with the ability to move money around and ensure that that money was put forward and spent in the timely manner that we believe that it was to be done. Sort of the good news is, and sort of the future look, is that we may use question one occasionally, and we may not. It all comes down to whether or not we can have, continue to have, which I really very firmly believe we will, the good relationship we have with the incoming governor. If we can negotiate these issues ahead of time, those things can be done through supplemental budgets. And that's the way I anticipate moving forward with this budget. We'll see a lot of negotiation back and forth, and I'm looking very much forward to that. I'm going to tell you just a little side issue, which was interesting yesterday. We had 25 bills in the committee yesterday, and it's a lot of nuts and bolts kind of bills. And one came up about the use of property tax credits for disabled veterans. And at the end of the presentation by the department, they said, "And we support this." And I told my committee at the time, everybody take a breath. Watch what's happening here. And what happened was that the administration came in and they gave an opinion. And we're very grateful for that. We spent 8 years where we were not receiving opinions about legislation. We weren't working in a cooperative fashion with the agencies to get things accomplished. And it just signaled a moment for me that something was different and special, and we're going to work together. Look, we've got a lot of huge issues throughout the budget. The reason I love the budget and am engaged with it is because it touches everything. And when people ask me what the priorities are, I say everything, because you pick a subject matter, from the environment to education, it all matters. We all get to where we are in life by our experiences. I believe our governor has had some extraordinary experiences. He talks about leaving no one behind. I share that, and I believe our legislature shares that. We have been focused for many years on those kinds of things. Things like the blueprint, which of course has been talked about for many years now, and we are funding it and have been doing a good job sort of pre-funding wherever we can with the surplus dollars that we had. That is the single best, in my opinion, the single best social and economic justice bill that we've ever passed. It's about really lifting people up. And that's what I want to, I think, say at the moment. We're going to use the budget how we have been using the budget, working cooperatively with the governor, with his ideas and his new ideas, particularly on the service plan that he's bringing forward. But we've worked in those areas too. We're going to keep working on those issues, and that's what we look forward to do. We can get a lot done together. We won't be using the tools that we used in the past. We won't be using the fencing anymore. We'll be working together to make things happen, and that's how I predict the rest of the session will go. Thank you.
Questions?
I don't know if you touched on this at all. I would assume at this point you've been briefed on the governor's budget. How in line with your priorities is what is coming to the legislature?
Sure. I would say, I don't want to steal their thunder on the details, but it was a very, very collaborative, and I thought very much in line with the large shared values that we have with the administration coming in. And I think there's a lot of room left in the budget for ongoing work, and I think that makes a lot of sense. With new secretaries, with new personnel, with the rebuilding of a refreshed government, I think that there is a lot of opportunity during the session to really dig into some of the things that we need to invest in moving forward. And the budget, from my perspective, reflected that sort of in a general way. Certainly, as we move forward, we'll have more specific comments on specific line items, but I think overall it was very much a budget of shared values.
Yes.
What does the legislature's new budget authority give you flexibility to do? If you can kind of expand on, you can move money around, et cetera.
Sure. So if the budget does not include something we think that is important, we can add it, but we have to figure out a way to pay for it with the existing funds that are placed in the budget. So it's not sort of an absolute, if you will, but it is a way of making things happen. And as I said, one of the sort of the best way for us to accomplish that goal really is not to use that question one authority, but really to work with the administration and get that added within supplemental budgets. Again, not that we wouldn't ever use it, because obviously there may come times when there is a philosophical difference between the governor and the legislature. But we have a great opportunity right now to get things done by cooperating through the supplementals.
Explain to us what the $69 million is. Where did it come from? And why was it just sitting there? Why didn't the previous governor use it? And why is this governor then able to use it?
Sure. So it was based on legislation largely that we passed last year. There was some that was related to providing abortion health services. There was some that had to do with the starting up the marijuana program, the cannabis program. Those pieces of legislation had component parts to spend money, and the governor did not want to spend that in that current year. We always had the control to add that to a mandate, and they actually are mandates for future years, but we didn't have it for that current year, which is what we're in right now. And so what we did was we fenced it off, said you can't spend this money for anything else other than these things. He chose, previous governor chose not to do that. New governor has chosen to do that.
In regard to the Bruen decision, I understand that there are still some pieces being worked out in New York with the Supreme Court. How far are you planning to push to the constitutional limit, and how will that inform throughout your bill process throughout the session?
First, I'll just say that after the Bruen decision, I think that'll ultimately result in more weapons in public spaces in Maryland, without question. And if you talk to state police, they'll tell you that normally they process about 13,000 to 14,000 applications a year for a wear carry permit. It's now up to 80,000, which means they're processing more in a month than they would in a calendar year. So there's, without question, going to be more weapons in public spaces in Maryland. What we're looking to do is to push not only the public spaces or sensitive locations definition to its farthest constitutional limit, and also to look into what mechanisms we can put in place to ensure that folks that are seeking these wear carry permits are going to get the proper training, the proper renewals, and the proper screening. So we're going to look to decipher what the circuits have said. Obviously, the circuits are split. Every day there's a new development in law in this area. So we're going to push to the constitutional limit to ensure that Marylanders are safe.
Chairman Smith.
Actually, I'm going to just add on this really quickly on this Bruen decision. I think there's a really important narrative here. When I walk into the doctor's office, or I go into a childcare facility, or I go into a church, I don't want to feel and wonder if the person next to me is carrying a firearm, if they've had a good or bad day. That's the real question that we're dealing with as a society here in the state of Maryland, but also across the country, is that, you know, when I go to the doctor, I want to go to a place where I can get my health care serviced. I don't want to sit down in the waiting room and wonder who may or may not be carrying a weapon. And we have to figure out under the new constitutional standard what that looks like. But it's a fundamental presumption question of what type of society do we want to live in? Do we want to live in one where we think that violence is solved by more guns? Or do we want to live in a society where we believe that people should have the opportunity to maximize their potential and not need a gun to feel safe? And so that's what we're going to have a robust debate about this year, and I think that's the real question for the General Assembly.
How many of these applications are because that people just don't feel safe? With violent crime going up in certain areas, a lot of juvenile crime, carjackings, that kind of thing, is that a response to just people being worried about going outside?
You know, you'd have to ask each individual about what their particular motivation may or may not be. Look, if people don't feel safe, nothing else matters. I think that's a fundamental standard that we all agree with. The question is, what do you do about it? Do you make sure that everybody is armed and has the opportunity to be their own independent agent, or do you create a safe community by investing in people, by providing real accountability when people break the law? It's a fundamental perception. It's about a value of how do we move forward as a society. Is it every person for themselves, or is it that we owe a duty to each other to figure out how to live together well? And so that's the open question in my mind.
Senator Ferguson, yesterday we heard from the governor talking about touting public safety as a top priority, specifically repeat violent offenders. We haven't seen any sort of legislation to back up that plan. Have you had any conversations with the governor? We have seen legislation that was drafted and introduced several years in a row from the previous administration. That didn't get through. Is that on the table this year?
I have not seen any legislation this year. Certainly we've in the Judicial Proceedings Committee and the Senate have moved some of these topics forward. At the end of the day, what I'm most encouraged by is the very obvious collaboration that's happening. From the beginning of the year, before the governor was sworn in, we saw coordination between new states' attorneys, new commissioners, the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney. Just yesterday, the governor was with the U.S. Attorney and the Attorney General of Maryland to demonstrate a commitment to collaboration. That is fundamentally what will work. We've had this conversation a lot about sentencing. Sentencing only matters if you have an arrest and you have a conviction. The challenge is right now, too many cases, because there is such distrust in the system, and because we've many complicating factors, we don't have arrests and we don't have those convictions. And so the sentence is at the end of the line. We've got to make sure that people trust in the system so that we can hold wrongdoers accountable, and also make sure that to the extent we can prevent them from engaging in criminal behavior in the first place. And so both sides matter.
But if repeat violent offenders is a top priority for the new governor, isn't that something that the legislature would work with him on?
Sure, if there's a piece of legislation, we'll certainly work through it.
Mr. President,
Did you want to add anything?
Mr. President, yesterday the governor announced he wants to create a cabinet-level Department of Service and Civic Innovation. Does the state need a new department at the cabinet level for that initiative?
Look, I think at the end of the day, the initiative is something that I personally, and I know the General Assembly has cared a great deal about. I personally was impacted dramatically by my experience in the classroom through an AmeriCorps program, Teach for America. I know that Senator Smith from his military service, I'm sure, would say the same thing. I think that Senator Gazzoni would agree that service is what brings us to this work every day and changes who we are as people. I think if fundamentally we in the state of Maryland can encourage more people to participate in public service and volunteerism and be a greater part of building a diverse fabric of society, we should do whatever it takes to make sure that that can happen. So we look forward to working with the administration with this executive order and the department that they seek to create in order to maximize the possibility that more Marylanders have the opportunity to serve.
So to be clear, you're supportive of a creation of a department that essentially expands state government?
Look, I think that I think it is streamlining state government as I see the executive order, that's pulling different pieces together under a secretary level impactful position. So I support making it a secretary level priority for this administration.
What was the budget cost for last year, just that number?
I'm sorry.
What was the budget for last year? What was the cost
Total?
of the state budget for last
For
year?
64 billion.
64 billion.
61 billion. This year's is 64.7. Yeah, right. Yeah, 61 billion.
Last year was 61 billion. You're not
All
sure
in.
about this year as yet.
Total revenues. This includes federal and you
Yeah,
want
it's
to
the
jump in?
whole, yeah, it's the whole picture. It's the general funds and as well as the special funds we get from everywhere, universities, it's a whole combined thing, but 61 billion, yeah.
61 billion.
Yeah, and I think in probably an hour, you'll know what the answer is to the next question.
You guys don't have an idea of what the budget might be for this year, the total cost?
It's slightly bigger than that.
Okay. I want to understand procedurally, what happens after this, after the governor presents his budget today? Because we know that you all have one job, and it's to pass a budget. So what happens from today until the last day?
So, so we are set up as a committee, the budget committees, both in the House and the Senate, and we have subcommittees. And our subcommittees are probably sort of the strongest subcommittees probably in the legislature in the sense that they are required to dig deep into the issue areas that they cover. We have an education subcommittee, we have a health subcommittee, we have one for transportation. They spend hours and hours going throughout the budget, line by line. The Department of Legislative Services will be preparing information about what's there and how it compares to what we've done before, and whether or not it makes sense to fit in, makes sense with what they are doing. In other words, are there things that there are potential cuts to be made? We'll be thinking this year for the first time really about potential additions in a lot of ways. So we're going to be spending weeks upon weeks, probably at least 8 to 12 weeks, working on those very minute parts of the budget. It all comes together, comes before the full committee looks at it. Eventually, we then bring it to the floor. But that's just like regular legislation in that sense.
And I want to get an understanding of what the surplus at this point. What is the surplus? And yesterday, the governor mentioned something about one-time funds that have to be used.
Right.
What's the number for that as well?
Right. This is a complicated one because it depends on how you look at it. But it was released during the fall that we had about a $2 billion surplus. I think that has risen into above $3 billion or more. The one-time nature of that is that we believe that that's the responsible way to deal with surpluses, right? You don't put that into your operating budget and then have that reflected over into the next year. You don't hire more people with that money and then have to pay them again next year when you may not have a surplus. I mean, look, what I believe the administration and the legislature can clearly agree on is that we are in some uncertain times. And the reality is that there's every expectation that there will be some sort of recession coming later in the year. And so with that in mind, when you asked how much surplus there is, it becomes one that we're doing some analysis and some element of just trying to do our best to figure out what might happen, because what might happen will affect what we ultimately have. We know this. We know that in the December numbers, already for the first time in several years, they've been coming down by about $170 million from what was projected. We're still above what the previous projections were. Complicated question, I'm sorry, or answer. But we know that when we get our numbers again in March, it's likely, no guarantee, but likely they may come down again based on that. And that gets back to how we deal with the budget. We get to the end of the budget at the end of March, and that's when we will get some more numbers from our revenue estimates. And then we'll take those numbers and possibly adjust what we're doing in the budget to make sure that we're reflecting what we think is the reality that is coming our way.
Concerns of eliminating the statute of limitations on child sex abuse cases, and haven't they been addressed previously? Because this isn't the first time this bill has come up.
So yes, you're right. It's been, we've dealt with this since 2003 in the legislature, and there are two questions. First, whether it's a statute of repose or limitations, which won't go into the details of that, but ultimately that doesn't matter. It's whether there's a vested right for the folks that have this is also another very complicated, antiquated answer, but the point is this. There are some significant constitutional issues at play here that deal with the statute of repose or limitations, whichever one you decide that it is. Either way you go, there's a significant constitutional hurdle there. The question is whether you want to give victims of child sex abuse their opportunity to make that case in court. And if you want to hold public entities and private entities responsible for their negligence in the past. And that's what that bill is about, and that's why we're going to take action on this issue in the legislature this year.
Chair Smith, have you received any pushback from the Catholic Church or any other institution since you announced earlier this week that you're cross-filing?
No, all of the issues have honestly centered on the constitutional and the legal issues presented. So no specific organization has come forward to oppose. It's all centered on the legal consequences of the legislation.
Chairman Smith, so Baltimore City State's Attorney Evan Bates was before your committee a couple days ago. Talked a lot about his plan to level the playing field when it comes to sentences for certain gun crimes. At the time, he said that no one in the Senate, he hadn't found a sponsor for that bill yet. Do you have any updates on that? Do you know?
I do not, but I'm glad you brought this back because, you know, we talked about Bruen, we talked about the influx of guns in Maryland. This isn't an either-or conversation because we did have the second part of that briefing was on violent crime and illegal guns in Maryland. And so if you look at the shall issue states before the Bruen decision, significant increases in gun violence with the shall issue states, with gun theft and use of a handgun in commission of crimes, supported by the Johns Hopkins University. Daniel Webster spoke to that, I thought, very eloquently. So there's a nexus between the two, but you can do both. We can combat violent offenders with illegal guns and also curtail the effects of the Bruen decision. So I think I just want to make sure that that narrative is there. We can do both, and we will. But no, to answer your specific question, no, I have not seen a piece of legislation.
Listening to it, it seemed like some of your colleagues were a bit hesitant to jump on board or perhaps support what the state's attorney was trying to get across. Do you worry that you say that you can do both, but if there's a lack of support in order to hold some of these illegal gun offenders accountable, will that piece fall off?
I think it's dependent on resources, and the Senate President spoke to this, and you're going to see in an hour about the historic investments in public safety from our governor. But look, what we also found out in this hearing, and which is what we all know, is that the enhancements don't necessarily curtail or dissuade people from committing violent acts. What does is swift and certain consequences, and you need the resources to implement those consequences. So ensuring that we have the ability to arrest and we have the ability to prosecute. So the hesitancy you saw was based on just the research that we've seen over the course of decades that enhancements don't necessarily curtail repeat violent offenders or violence.
Chair Cazzoni or Senate President Ferguson, you touched on the blueprint a little bit. Can you talk about what you need to see from the budget this year on for funding for the blueprint, what aspects of it you need to fund this year, and what the challenges have been so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall what we want to see is the funding of the formula as it was contemplated. This is now, I think we're in official year 2 of the implementation plan. We're in a bit of a wonky scheduling because of the previous veto and subsequent override. And so this is the first real expansion of those initial blueprint dollars. So increasing the number of community schools, increasing the number of students who have greater access to services, who come from limited means or who have English as a second language, or for special education students. So we're also going to see a greater investment in teachers, making sure that they have the ability to pursue the national board certification and that we can have the best and brightest teachers in the country. And then we will continue to have robust accountability, which is going to be essential. This is the first year that the Accountability Board will be in operation for a full fiscal year with full funding. It is essential that we increase our investment, but also that we do it efficiently and that we make sure that every dollar is used as effectively as possible. And so that's why the Accountability Board is so crucial. One of the things that we're hoping to see is we know in the out years that we have increased costs. And so while we have a surplus, we want to use this money smartly. We want to think about where there could be future costs down the line in education, but in other areas too. And so we'll be looking, I think the administration shares our cautious outlook that we should be investing now to be prepared for the future.
Any proposed changes in tax policy? I mean, given surplus, could there be some tax cuts anywhere? Could there be some tax increases? Anything that?
Look, everything is potentially still on the table. We're still at the beginning of session. You've seen some areas. We want to make sure that families are protected. And so when we think about some of the things that we've done in the past around the earned income tax credit or child care tax credits, these are things that the legislature has pursued and that have to be renewed or reviewed. And so I suspect that will be an issue coming up this year. We did it 2 years ago in the midst of the pandemic to make sure that families who were struggling had additional resources to be able to provide for their children. That's something that we certainly continue to care about and look forward to working with the administration on.
We have about 2 more minutes, guys.
Looking at all of this money that's being, we're talking about investing, we saw the $69 million yesterday. We talk about accountability, we heard that from the governor, we're hearing it now. What specific measures are in place to ensure that this money that's going out and being spent isn't just being spent perhaps loosely, or are there specific accountability measures in place for all of this money that we're seeing that's a one-time use or new investments that are being made?
Yeah, look, I think that's the job of the General Assembly. Right. At the end of the day, that's our job, right? Our job is to make sure that that money that Marylanders pay as taxpayers is used as effectively as possible. And that's why we're back every year to review and through the budget process. I'll let the chairman jump in on it, but that's our job, is to fundamentally make sure that the dollars are used at their highest and best use.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is our history, and we have lots of different things in place, including the biggest of which is our audit function. And between the analysis that our Department of Legislative Services does and the audits that are performed routinely every year all throughout government, that's what we do, and we review all of that, and we're careful about that. Look, with the money, the surplus money that's coming in, and the things that we would like to see spent on are obviously one time, when I mean capital expenditures. Let me say that we've got some interesting situations because of inflation right now, right? We made some investments last year in a lot of capital, and costs have risen. So one of the responsible things that I think we should be doing right now is looking at all those projects that we funded last year and make sure that they can continue and actually get built. The last thing we want is things halfway done. So we're going to be looking having this new information about the way the economy is turning, and using that information, using all the resources that we have around us to figure out, to ensure that everything that we spend money on is well spent.
I want to ask one last question about professional development. The governor has said that that's something that is key to his goals. What would you like to see in the budget proposal today with regard to that professional development?
Oh, in terms of state workers and the vacancy rates, is that where you're?
Not even just state workers, like people who may need help to develop their skills.
Oh, in workforce. Is it, it's a,
Workforce
sure. No, look, I think that they're going to, this is an area, and I don't want to get too far ahead of the governor in any way. We have been talking about the challenge in Maryland of the jobs that are being created that require some level of career certification or degree-based. It's about 2/3 of jobs being created in Maryland require some sort of higher credential, and about 1/3 of Marylanders who graduate from Maryland high schools 10 years later have that credential. So there is a skills mismatch. There is a massive skills gap here in the state of Maryland that we have got to address if we want people to have access to economic opportunity. I know that this is something that the governor and his prior work and work that he and I have done together in the city of Baltimore to make sure that people can access the skills to maximize their own potential. I suspect we'll see some substantial investments there, and look forward to working through the details of how we can ensure that Marylanders can get the skills they need to compete globally. Thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, thank you all very much. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.